He sent out 100 job applications and got nothing back. One small change. His name. And suddenly the phone wouldn't stop ringing. But that truth cut deeper than rejection ever did. He decided to speak out, to show the world his name wasn't a weakness. It was his strength. Because no name should ever be a barrier to dignity, justice, and opportunity. He sat in front of his laptop with the screen glowing back at him like an open wound. The cursor blinked on the page where his resume had been carefully updated, polished, and perfected for the 100th time. Every bullet point felt like a plea, every line of experience stacked like bricks in a wall he hoped would stand tall enough to be noticed. His name sat at the top of the document in bold. Quamadami. To him, it was more than a name, it was an inheritance. A thread tied to generations who had lived, struggled, and survived. It carried the rhythm of his ancestors' homeland, the weight of a father's pride and a mother's whispered prayers. But to the world beyond the screen, it seemed to be something else entirely. A barrier. For months, he had been applying. Job after job. Corporate positions, entry-level roles, nonprofits, startups, anywhere his degree and years of experience could be of value. He wasn't naive. He knew competition was tough. But still, something didn't add up. 100 applications. And the silence was deafening. Not a single call. Not one email of interest. The silence wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. It was as though the name at the top of his resume had cast a shadow so dark that nothing else could shine through. At first, Quam tried to brush it off. Maybe the economy was bad. Maybe companies were overwhelmed with applicants. Maybe his cover letters weren't as strong as he thought. He stayed up late reworking every sentence, attending virtual resume workshops, tailoring his words for each posting, desperate to crack the invisible code. Yet the response was always the same, nothing. Each day, his hope chipped away a little more. The once steady confidence in his voice when he told friends, "I'm still looking, but I know something will come," began to waver behind. Closed doors, he scrolled through his dwindling bank account, calculating how many more months of rent he could afford. How long before the bills demanded what he couldn't give? The rejection wasn't just professional, it was personal. It reached deep into the marrow of who he was. Then came the night he would never forget. He was on the phone with a friend, another black man navigating the same struggle. The conversation was heavy, but it took a turn when his friend lowered his voice and said, "Look, bro, I'll tell you something that worked for me. It hurt to do it, but it worked. I changed my name on my resume. Dropped the African, kept it simple. I went from Kofi to Kevin, and the call started coming in." Quam froze. The words hit like a slap. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind, or maybe he had buried it deep because he knew what it meant. To change his name was to erase part of himself. But the silence on the other end of his application spoke louder than pride. That night, he opened his resume and stared at the top. The bold letters glared back. Quamadami. He backspaced slowly, his heart heavy, and replaced it with something he thought sounded neutral, safe, digestible. Michael Adams. It felt like betrayal. Like cutting away a piece of his soul. Yet a part of him whispered, maybe this is survival. Maybe this is what it takes to break through the wall. He saved the document under a new name and began sending it out again. The difference was immediate. Within a week, the phone began to ring. Recruiters who had once ignored him suddenly wanted to know more. Emails popped into his inbox, warm and welcoming, asking if he was available for interviews. "Michael, your resume is impressive. We'd love to talk." The very same words he had prayed to hear for months now came freely, yet instead of joy. Each message filled him with something colder, heavier, because deep down he knew it wasn't his skills that had changed. It wasn't his experience. It wasn't his education. It was just his name. The truth hit harder than the rejection ever did. Each phone call was a reminder that the world wasn't blind to his qualifications. It was blind to him. The name his parents had given him, the name tied to history, heritage, and identity, had been enough to close doors before he even had the chance to knock. And the cruelest part? The doors opened wide when he wore a mask. He went to interviews as Michael. He shook hands, smiled, answered questions, all while carrying a secret that sat heavy on his chest. He wondered if the people across the table would see him differently if they knew the truth. Would their warm smiles falter? Would the opportunity evaporate if Michael revealed himself to be Kwame? Each moment of success was laced with bitterness, as though every step forward was built on the erasure of who he really was, yet he pushed on. Because bills didn't wait, and dreams didn't fund themselves. Still, Every night he returned home, removed the mask, and whispered his name to himself in the quiet. Quemadeimi. He said it out loud as if to remind himself that he still existed, that he hadn't been swallowed whole by the world's refusal to see him. The sound of his own name was both comfort and wound, a reminder of what was at stake. And in those quiet moments, a question began to form in his mind, one that would haunt him until he found an answer. What does it mean to succeed if success requires you to erase who you are? Following weeks unfolded like a cruel experiment. Quain, now Michael on paper, was suddenly ushered into spaces that had once seemed impenetrable. Recruiters who had left his earlier applications buried without a glance were now praising his qualifications, impressed by the same degree, the same work history, the same skill set. The only difference was the name. Each interview felt like standing on a stage, reciting lines for an audience that didn't know they were watching a performance. He wore the carefully pressed suit, the confident smile, the practiced handshake. He spoke with clarity, intelligence, and warmth, traits he had always carried. But as he said the words, "I'm Michael," it felt as though the room tilted slightly, as though part of him was left standing in the shadows outside. One afternoon, after his third interview in a single week, he sat in his car in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, his chest tight. He should have been celebrating. Opportunities were finally appearing. But instead, a quiet grief settled over him. Reflection in the rearview mirror looked back with tired eyes, asking the question he hadn't dared to voice out loud. If they don't want me as Quen, do they want me at all? The memory of his childhood bubbled up unexpectedly. He could hear his mother's voice, soft but firm, teaching him the meaning of his name. Quam, she would say, born on a Saturday. A Demi worthy of respect and dignity. To her, his name was a crown, something to be carried with pride. To the world he was now navigating, it was a burden, a wall that blocked him from opportunity. The contradiction gnawed at him like a hidden wound. As the weeks went on, he landed a job offer. On the surface, it was everything he had been working toward: steady pay, room for growth, a place where his skills could finally shine. But as he sat across from the hiring manager, hearing the words, "Congratulations, Michael," he felt the hollowness of victory. It was like winning a race with someone else's shoes on. He had crossed the finish line, but the journey didn't feel like his own. At his first day of work, the mask followed him through the doors. His badge read Michael Adams. His coworkers greeted him with casual friendliness, unaware that every "Hey, Michael" was another small cut, another reminder that they didn't see him, only the version of himself he had created to survive. He excelled at his tasks, earned praise for his dedication, and contributed meaningfully. Yet no amount of professional validation could heal the fracture inside. In the break room one afternoon, a colleague asked casually, "So, Michael, where's your family from?" It was an innocent question, the kind asked in idle conversation. Quain froze for a moment, coffee cup halfway to his lips. He considered the answer carefully. Should he say Nigeria, proud and direct? Should he soften it, give a vague answer, to avoid the follow-up questions? Should he weave the same careful mask around his identity that he had built for his name? He smiled and answered simply, "My parents are from West Africa." His colleague nodded politely and moved on, but Quain sat with the weight of it long after. The truth had slipped out, but in a muted way, stripped of its vibrancy, its history, its power. And that night, alone in his apartment, he whispered the full truth into the silence. "I am Kwame. I am not Michael Adams." The duality of his existence began to wear on him. At work, he was efficient, professional, agreeable. At home, he was exhausted from the effort of holding himself together. He found himself avoiding mirrors, avoiding long conversations with friends who knew him by his real name, afraid that even speaking it aloud would deepen the ache of the lie he was living. But the most painful moment came weeks later, when his younger cousin visited from out of town. The boy was only 12, full of energy and curiosity. As they sat together on the couch, his cousin asked about his new job. "Do they call you Quaim there?" the boy asked innocently. Quaim hesitated, his throat tightening, before answering quietly, "No, they call me Michael." The boy frowned. "But why? Your name is Quaim. That's who you are." The simplicity of the child's logic cut deeper. than any adult's judgment ever could. Quaim forced a smile, ruffling his cousin's hair, but inside he felt the crushing weight of truth. If a 12-year-old could see so clearly what he had been forced to compromise, what did that say about the world he was trying to succeed in? That night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, his cousin's words echoing in his mind. That's who you are. He thought about the generations before him who had carried their names with pride, even in the face of far greater barriers than job applications. He thought about the strength his parents instilled in him, the resilience woven into his identity, and he wondered, was survival worth the cost of silence? In the weeks that followed, Quaim's inner conflict deepened. Every achievement at work was tinged with bitterness, every paycheck a reminder of the compromise he had made. He began to write in a journal at night, spilling the thoughts he couldn't voice anywhere else. When I am Quaim, the world ignores me. When I am Michael, they welcome me. But both are me. Why can't they see that? It was in those journal entries that the seeds of change began to take root. The pain was undeniable, but so was the pride. The question was no longer whether he could survive as Michael it was, whether he could truly live as Kwame. And as the days passed, the whisper inside him grew louder, insistent, unrelenting. One day I will no longer hide. One day they will know my name. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending, one that doesn't just drain the body, but hollows out the spirit. Quaim began to feel that hollowness more acutely as the months passed. He was performing well at work. His manager praised him. His colleagues respected him. From the outside, it looked like everything was falling into place. But every time someone said Michael, he felt a subtle fracture forming inside. Like a small crack running deeper and deeper through glass, he had become an expert at compartmentalizing. At the office, he was the reliable, affable professional, quick to respond, eager to contribute, always composed. At home, he let the mask fall. He would close his apartment door, loosen his tie, and sink into the couch, his silence louder than any noise. The journal on his nightstand had become his confessional. Page after page, he poured out the duality he was living, the ache of invisibility even in plain sight. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, he came across a news article. The headline read, "New study reveals bias against ethnic names and hiring practices." He tapped on it, drawn in by something deeper than curiosity. As he read, his heart tightened. The study laid it out in stark terms. Applicants with ethnic-sounding names, particularly Black and African names, were significantly less likely to receive callbacks. Even when their qualifications matched or exceeded their peers, it wasn't paranoia, it wasn't imagination, it was data. It was fact. The world had been telling him no before it even read who. He closed his eyes and let the truth settle in. He thought about all the resumes he'd sent out as Kwame, each one a seed cast into the wind, never given the chance to root. He thought about the silence that had followed each submission, not because he was unqualified, but because his name had spoken before he ever had the chance to. And now, as Michael, those same doors swung open, he didn't feel vindicated. He felt violated. Later that week, his company hosted a diversity and inclusion meeting. The irony was not lost on him. Sitting in the conference room, he watched as executives spoke earnestly about representation, equity, and the importance of fostering an inclusive environment. He listened to words like authenticity and belonging tossed around like confetti, well-intentioned but hollow. Because as they spoke, Quaim, who was living behind an alias, sat in silence, his real name tucked away like a secret shame. When the floor opened for discussion, he hesitated. His heart pounded. He looked around the room at the faces of his colleagues, some sincere, some performative. A voice inside him urged caution. Stay quiet. Don't rock the boat. You've worked too hard to get here. But another voice, quieter, older, whispered back, you didn't come this far just to disappear. He raised his hand. When he began to speak, the room shifted. I want to share something personal, he said, his voice steady, but waited. When I applied to this company, I didn't use my real name. My real name is Kwame. I used the name Michael Adams on my resume because I had sent out over 100 applications with my real name and never heard. Back. When I changed it, suddenly the calls came in. Silence fell across the room. He continued, I want to be clear, I'm grateful to be here. I love the work I do. But I've been living a divided life. Every time someone says, Michael, it reminds me that who I am wasn't considered enough. That my name was a barrier before my skills were even seen. His words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. Some people shifted in their seats, others lowered their eyes. His manager looked stunned, but Quaim didn't waver. I'm telling you this because I believe we can't talk about inclusion if we don't also talk about the ways bias shows up long before someone walks through the door. We can't talk about belonging if we only accept people once they've altered themselves to be palatable. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, a few people nodded. One colleague raised her hand and said softly, Thank you, that was brave. Another added, I've never thought about how names play into this. Thank you for opening my eyes. Quaim left the meeting unsure of what would come next. But something inside him had shifted. For the first time in months, he had spoken his truth out loud. Not whispered in the dark, not scribbled into a journal, but spoken with clarity and dignity. He had reclaimed his name not as an apology, but as a declaration. The following week, he went to HR and requested that his email signature and internal records be updated to reflect his real name. I'd like to be listed as Quaim Adeyemi moving forward, he said. The HR rep blinked, surprised, but nodded and made the change. The first time he received an internal email addressed to Quaime, he stared at it for a long time. It looked strange and beautiful, like seeing a loved one return after a long absence. It was just a name, yes, but it was also everything. It was identity, it was legacy, it was resistance. Some colleagues asked questions. Oh, is Quaim your middle name? Did you just decide to start using that now? He answered with grace. Quaim is my real name. It always has been, I just wasn't sure this place would accept it. Now I'm choosing to be fully myself. Not everyone understood. Some people gave awkward nods and changed the subject, but others stopped by his desk to thank him. One black coworker pulled him aside and said quietly, Man, I've been thinking about doing the same. You don't know how much it means to see you do that. Quaim realized then that his choice wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been told, directly or indirectly, that their identity was inconvenient. It was about the quiet, daily indignities endured by those whose names didn't fit neatly into the comfort zones of hiring managers. It was about visibility not just for himself, but for those who came after him. That night he called his mother. When she answered, he said softly, Mom, I told them my real name today. There was a pause, then the warmth of her voice. You told them Quaim Adeyemi? Yes, he said, his throat tightening. I told them who I am. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said with pride and relief, Then my son has come home. Quaim closed his eyes and let the words wrap around him like a blessing. He was not Michael. He had never been Michael. He was Quaim Adeyemi. And the world would learn his name. For the first time in months, Quaim walked into the office carrying not just his laptop bag, but a sense of alignment. The name badge clipped to his chest no longer felt like a disguise. It read Quaim Adeyemi, and every time he caught sight of it, a quiet strength rose in his chest. The world hadn't collapsed. The sky hadn't fallen. He was still here working, thriving, and now, fully himself. But the journey was far from over. There were subtle changes in how people interacted with him. Some colleagues stumbled over his name at first, awkwardly repeating it until they got it right. Others, perhaps out of discomfort, began shortening it without asking, K. He corrected them politely each time. It's Quaim A. Some learned quickly, grateful for the correction. Others smiled sheepishly and carried on, not realizing how much weight rested in those syllables. He knew they didn't mean harm. Yet each misstep reminded him how invisible respect could be when it came to names like his. For years he had been the one to bend, to soften, to make things easier for others. But not anymore. His identity was not negotiable. Outside of work, Quaim began paying closer attention to the stories around him. He started reading articles, listening to podcasts, and joining online communities where Black professionals shared their experiences. Again and again, he saw reflections of his own story qualified candidates overlooked. Resumes discarded, doors closed before they could even knock. Some had Americanized their names. Others had chosen nicknames to fit in. Some had given up entirely. The stories were different, but the root was the same. A system that made their very existence a test. It angered him, but it also gave him perspective. He was not alone. His struggle was not isolated. It was part of a larger truth, one that too often went unspoken. One evening, scrolling through a professional networking site, he stumbled upon a thread titled, "The Power of Our Names." Hundreds of comments filled the page. Some people shared how they had insisted on being addressed correctly, even at the cost of opportunities. Others admitted, with shame and pain, that they had changed their names just to survive. Reading their words, Quaim felt a surge of connection. His journal had been his private outlet, but here was a community of voices carrying the same burden. He wasn't just one man against the tide, he was part of something bigger. The next day, he drafted a post of his own. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, nerves tightening his chest. But he began to type. "For years, I sent out resumes with my real name, Quaim Adeyemi, 100 applications. Not one callback. Out of desperation, I changed my name to Michael Adams. Within weeks, I had interviews and a job. I kept the mask on, but it weighed heavy. Recently, I reclaimed my name at work, and I want to say this to anyone who needs to hear it. Your name is not the problem. Bias is the problem. You are enough exactly as you are." He hesitated before pressing post. But once he did, the words no longer belonged only to him, they belonged to anyone who needed them. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of likes turned into hundreds. Comments poured in. Gratitude, solidarity, heartbreak, encouragement. "Thank you for saying this. I thought I was the only one. I've been afraid to do the same." His inbox filled with messages. From strangers who shared their own stories, people in law, medicine, tech, education, all united by the invisible weight of names that others had refused to honor. For the first time, Quaim's pain transformed into purpose. He realized his story could be more than just personal, it could be a spark. At work, he noticed small shifts. 2 colleagues who once stumbled over his name began pronouncing it correctly with confidence. His manager pulled him aside one day and said, "Quaim, I want you to know what you shared in that meeting made me think differently about a lot of things. I don't want anyone else to feel like they need to hide who they are here." It wasn't a revolution overnight. Change rarely is. But it was something. A ripple in still water. And yet, despite the progress, the reality of the world outside his office remained harsh. When Quaim updated his resume back to his real name and began exploring new opportunities, the silence returned. The calls slowed, the rejection letters trickled in again. It was proof that while he could reclaim his identity within one company, the wider world still carried the same blinders. One evening, after receiving yet another rejection, he sat with his journal open and wrote a single question across the page: "What am I willing to sacrifice and what am I not?" The answer came slowly, but clearly. He would not sacrifice his name again. Not for a job, not for a paycheck, not for the comfort of others. He had tasted what it felt like to shrink himself, and he had no intention of doing it again. Instead, he began to imagine a different path. What if his name wasn't just something to defend, but something to build upon? What if the very thing the world dismissed could become the foundation for change? The idea took root quietly, like a seed planted in rich soil. He didn't know exactly what it would grow into: a book, a podcast, a platform, a movement. But he knew this. He would not go back to silence. His name carried power, and it was time the world learned to hear it. That night he called his father. They hadn't spoken deeply about the job search, about Michael, about the pain of erasure. But when his father answered, Quaim found himself confessing everything. "I changed my name on my resume, Dad. I thought it was the only way, and it worked, but it broke something in me. There was silence on the line, then his father's voice, steady and resolute. Son, the world will try to make you believe you are less. It will try to bend you until you disappear. But remember this, your name is not a burden. It is a banner. It tells the story of who you are and where you come from. Don't ever put it down again. Quaim's throat tightened. Tears welled in his eyes, but they were not tears of defeat, they were of recognition. His father's words were not just advice, they were permission. They were freedom. From that moment on, Quaim knew his path forward would not be defined by hiding. He would carry his name boldly, even when the world turned away. Especially when the world turned away, because survival without dignity was not living. And he was done living halfway. Quaim had always thought of his journey as a private one, a battle waged quietly within the four walls of his apartment, or silently in the lines of his resume. But after reclaiming his name, after speaking up in that meeting, something inside him had shifted. His story no longer belonged to him alone. It had become a mirror for others, and in their reflections he saw the possibility of something greater. The post he had written online continued to ripple outward. Messages arrived daily from people across the country, even across the globe, sharing their own struggles. A woman from Chicago wrote, "I stopped using my birth name years ago because employers kept mispronouncing it. Reading your post made me realize how much I've lost by hiding." A man in London said, "I thought it was just me. I never realized others were fighting the same battle." Quaim read each one, sometimes with tears in his eyes, sometimes with anger boiling in his chest. These weren't isolated stories. They were threads in a larger fabric of exclusion, woven so tightly into society that most people never noticed. But the ones who lived it carried the weight every day. The more he read, the more he realized his silence had once made him complicit. By hiding behind Michael Adams, he had unknowingly reinforced the very bias that had shut him out. But now he had a chance to do something different, to turn his pain into testimony, his story into a platform. He began small. He wrote essays late at night, carefully weaving his personal experiences with research and history. He spoke about the power of names, how they carried identity, culture, and legacy. He cited studies, shared statistics, and connected them with lived experiences. He spoke about his ancestors, about his parents who had named him with intention, and about the child he hoped one day to raise, a child who would not have to choose between opportunity and authenticity. One essay went viral. It was titled, "When My Name Became a Wall." In it, he described the feeling of being unseen, of watching his qualifications erased by a bias so deep it operated before he ever entered the room. The piece spread across social media, landing on the screens of educators, employers, and activists. Invitations began to trickle in, first to small podcasts, then to community events, then to panel discussions on workplace equity. Quaim found himself stepping into a new role. No longer just the job seeker or the quiet professional. He became a voice measured, steady, and unflinching on behalf of those who had been silenced. Standing at podiums, speaking into microphones, his heart still pounded with nerves. But each time he said, "My name is Quaim Adeyemi," he felt the ground beneath him grow firmer. At work, some colleagues watched with admiration. Others seemed wary, unsure of what to make of his growing visibility. His manager pulled him aside one afternoon and said, "Quaim, I support what you're doing. Just be careful. Sometimes companies don't like when employees become too outspoken." Quaim listened politely but walked away with clarity. For too long, fear had been the chain around his neck. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of being seen as too much. But fear had also been the reason he erased himself in the first place. He had no intention of returning to that cage. In the months that followed, Quaim's advocacy grew. He joined forces with organizations pushing for blind hiring practices systems, where resumes were stripped of names to prevent bias from interfering. He collaborated with diversity officers to create training modules that included the significance of names, not just as identifiers, but as identities. He spoke in schools, reminding young students that their names were gifts, not burdens. and that the world's inability to pronounce them was not their shame to carry. Still, he wrestled with doubts. Late at night he wondered, was he risking his career by being so outspoken? Was he painting a target on his back? He thought of the rent, the bills, the responsibilities. But then he thought of his cousin, the boy who had once asked him why. He wasn't called Kwame at work. He thought of the children in classrooms, quietly wondering if their names would someday betray them. And he realized if he stayed silent, he would only be preserving a world where their silence would also be required. He couldn't accept that. One evening, he was invited to speak at a university event on identity and belonging. The auditorium was filled with students, black, brown, immigrant, first-generation faces that carried the same questions he had carried at their age. When he told them his story, when he described the moment he typed Michael Adams onto his resume, the room grew still. And when he told them the moment he reclaimed his name, the applause that followed was not just for him, but for themselves, for the possibility of their own reclamation. Afterward, a young woman approached him. She wore her hair in long braids and carried herself with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "My name is Naya," she said softly. "I've been thinking of going by Nicole when I graduate. Do you think I should?" Kwame looked at her, remembering his own reflection in the rearview mirror that day outside an interview, the heaviness in his chest. He shook his head gently. "Naya, your name is beautiful. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. The problem isn't your name, it's the bias. And we need your name to be heard, not hidden." Her eyes welled with tears and she nodded. "Thank you." Moments like that reminded him why he couldn't turn back. And at home, his journal had begun to change too. The entries were no longer filled with questions of survival, but visions of future. "What if we built a network for professionals with unacceptable names?" he wrote one night. "What if we created scholarships, mentorships, resources? What if our names became doors, not walls?" The seed of an idea was becoming something bigger, something alive. He didn't know what shape it would take yet, but he knew the direction. Forward, unapologetically. As Kwame Adeyemi, he closed his journal, whispered his name into the quiet, and felt the words not as a wound this time, but as a vow. Tomorrow, he would continue. Tomorrow, the work would grow, because tomorrow, more people needed to hear what he had learned. A name is never a barrier. It is the world that builds the walls, and it is up to us to break them. The seasons shifted, and with them, so did Kwame. What had begun as a private ache had grown into something larger than himself. His story had found an audience. His pain had become testimony. And his name, once seen as a barrier, had become a banner. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when doubt crept in. Moments when the rejection letters stung. When the silence of unanswered applications reminded him that bias was still alive and well. But Kwame no longer carried those wounds alone. He had built community, and in that community he found strength. Each story he heard, each hand he shook, each voice that whispered "me too" became another brick in the foundation of his resolve. One evening, he was invited to deliver a keynote at a conference on workplace equity. The ballroom was filled with hundreds of professionals, executives in suits, students in borrowed ties, community leaders, teachers, and workers from all walks of life. Standing at the podium, under the bright stage lights, Kwame felt a calm he hadn't known before. He began, as he always did now, by saying his name, slowly, deliberately, with the weight it deserved. "My name is Kwame Adeyemi." The room grew quiet. He told them about the 100 resumes. He told them about the silence. He told them about the mask he had worn, the false name that had opened doors at the cost of his dignity. And then he told them about the day he took it back. "When you hear a name you don't recognize, you have a choice," he said, his voice steady, carrying to the farthest corner of the room. "You can see it as a burden, or you can see it as a doorway into someone's story, someone's history, someone's humanity. Our names are not the problem. Bias is the problem. And until we confront that truth, we will continue to lose talent, to break spirits, to silence voices before they can even speak." He looked around the room, letting his words settle. "I want you to remember this. When you say someone's name, you're not just addressing them, you're honoring their existence." The applause that followed wasn't the kind that faded quickly. It was long, sustained, rising like a tide, and in that moment Conan felt something loosen in his chest. He had spent so long shrinking, doubting, hiding, But here, standing in his full truth, he had become not just visible, but undeniable. After the speech, people lined up to speak with him. Some shared their own experiences. Others simply said, "Thank you." One older man, his voice thick with emotion, said, "I changed my name when I came to this country 40 years ago. I've regretted it every day. Hearing you tonight gave me something back." Quaim went home that night with his heart full. The work was not finished, he knew that. But for the first time, he believed it could be. Even in the months that followed, he launched an initiative with a few colleagues and community leaders. They called it Say My Name. It began as a campaign workshops in schools, training for companies, storytelling projects online, but it quickly grew. Organizations reached out. Universities wanted to host events. Media outlets covered the movement. People began sharing their names with pride, reclaiming syllables once buried under nicknames and compromises. Quaim watched it unfold with awe. He had once thought his story was about survival. Now he saw it was about transformation. The very thing that had once been used to keep him out was now being used to bring others in. At home, his journal pages shifted again. He no longer filled them with questions of identity or survival. Instead, they brimmed with plans, visions, hopes. What if every child grew up hearing their name spoken with respect? He wrote, what if companies learned to see diversity, not as an obligation, but as a strength? What if the next generation never had to erase themselves to be seen? One quiet Sunday afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, his cousin, the same boy who had once asked why he wasn't called, Quaim at work, came to visit again. He was older now, taller, his voice deepening with adolescence. They sat together, flipping through photos on Quaim's laptop from recent events. "You're everywhere," his cousin said, smiling. "On stages, in articles. People know your name now?" Quaim laughed softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, they do." His cousin looked at him, serious now. "I'm glad you didn't stay, Michael." Quaim's throat tightened. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "So, am I because I want you to know whatever path you take. Whoever you become, you never need to erase yourself to fit in. Your name is enough. You are enough." The boy nodded, his eyes bright, and in that moment, Quaim realized the true weight of what he was building. This wasn't just about resumes. It wasn't just about jobs. It was about legacy, about ensuring that those who came after him would not have to make the same compromises, fight the same battles, carry the same scars. That night, as the sun dipped low and the city lights began to glow, Quaim stood at his window and whispered his name one more time. Not as a reminder, not as a wound, but as a declaration. Quaim Adaimi. It rolled off his tongue with strength, with pride, with finality. He thought of his ancestors, of his parents, of every person who had ever been told their name was too strange, too foreign, too much. And he thought of the future, the children, the students, the professionals who would walk through doors he had once found closed. A smile spread across his face. His name was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge, and through it others would cross.